6 resin bonded diamond sharpening stones for $70. That's $11.60 per stone. Are they cheap? Yes. Do they work? Yes. Are they a good value? Probably not, but let me show you why. Now I have to preface this review with this real quick. I believe Resin Pro sells 2 different versions of these resin bonded diamond stones. Now I believe, and I may be incorrect here because there's nothing that says otherwise online, but I believe that these are the older version of these stones. I don't know if these particular stones are being phased out, but they are still selling these. They do make another resin bonded diamond stone. They look slightly different than these, which I do plan on doing a review on. But to keep you guys from getting confused, what I'm going to do is simply just link to these exact stones down below in the pinned comment. So if you are doing research on these stones, you'll be able to tell exactly which stones that I'm talking about here just by clicking that link and going straight there. That's exactly where I bought these. And hopefully in the near future, I'll get my hands on the newer versions. I'm not exactly sure if they're actually newer versions or not, but I'll get my hands on the other versions of the resin bonded stones from Resin Pro. Now, with that being said, let's get back to the review. So first off, we have the 200 grit stone. As you can see, we have all different sizes of diamond particles in this stone. And we have some very coarse particles as well, which is what does the cutting. In this coarse grit stone, grit contamination doesn't really matter. We just want something that removes material quickly, which is what the stone does. However, it is a very soft stone and it does wear fairly quickly. I only sharpened a couple of knives and it's showing considerable wear after only a couple knives. It does look like it is wearing fairly quickly. Next we have the 400 grit, which again has some very coarse particles and everything in between. Overall, it does leave a finer scratch pattern than the 200 grit. So overall, we are getting progressively finer. Okay, so before we move on to the finer grits, I have to jump in here and explain something about the diamond particles in general. Now, a lot of you probably think that the diamond used in these sharpening stones is super expensive because it's diamond. But the fact of the matter is that the diamonds used in these cheap diamond sharpening stones is actually fairly cheap. The diamond abrasive in and of itself is not that expensive. What is expensive is to get diamond particles that are accurately graded. Essentially, let's say that our cheap 800 grit diamond stone, we need 800 grit diamond. Obviously, but we want to save some money and make these stones as cheaply as possible. So we buy the cheap abrasive, which ends up being particle sizes with a relatively large range in particle size. So we'll end up with, this is a very poorly drawn diagram here, but we'll end up with a bunch of particles that are sort of the same around the 800 grit range, but we'll also have particles that are quite a bit bigger than 800 grit. We'll also get some particles that are quite a bit smaller than 800 grit. Now overall, the average particle size is going to be 800 grit. This would be what is in relatively cheap diamond sharpening stones like these. And here's the literal example of this with the 800 grit stone. We can see some larger particles as well as some very small particles with an overall average of about 800 grit. Now, as we get more expensive, as we want to increase the quality of the sharpening stones, let's say, fingers are bad erasers. Let's say that we want a better quality 800 grit sharpening stone. So we spend quite a bit more money for more accurately graded particles. That means that we're going to get a particle consistency that is much closer together. This is what's actually expensive, not the diamond in and of itself, but the grade of the diamonds and how closely the particles are to one another. That's where things can start to get more expensive. And again, here's another literal example of this. This is the Nanohone 50 micron resin bonded diamond stone. The Nanohone diamond stones are some of the best I've seen in terms of grit consistency. The particles are all exactly the same size, but this resin bonded stone is very expensive. So on these cheaper diamond stones, you'll see a much wider range in particle sizes on the sharpening stone itself. Now, as we look at the 800 grit, the 1200 grit, the 3000 grit, and the 6000, this starts to become more apparent. We can see large particles as well as smaller particles embedded into the matrix. And this becomes very obvious once we look at the scratch pattern itself. We can still see these large particles leaving very deep scratches in the surface of the bevel. Why does this matter, because the only time that you actually need resin bonded diamond stones is on the finer grits. For anything up to about 1200 grit, which is these first 4 stones right here, you're actually better off using cheaper plated diamond stones. Not only are they going to last longer than these relatively thin resin bonded diamond stones, but they're also going to stay flat, completely flat all the time, which on these cheaper resin bonded diamond stones is actually kind of a problem, especially on the 200, on the profiling grits, where you really actually need them on the 200 and the 400 grit. These stones, they just dish out and they wear out a little bit too fast for my liking. So if you already have a coarse grit plated diamond stone and a fine grit plated diamond stone, either 1x6" stones or a larger freehand stone, the coarse grit and fine grit plated diamond stones actually do a better job than the first 4 of the cheaper resin bonded stones. And by coarse grit and fine grit, I mean a coarse grit profiling stone, either 220 to 320, you can even go coarser than that, and a fine grit somewhere between 800 and 1200 grit. Again, these grits in plated diamond stones do a better job than the first 4 grits of the cheaper resin bonded stones, which kind of only leaves us with the 3000 and 6000 grit. Now this is why this sort of grit contamination thing kind of matters, because on the 3000 grit, there's really, there's too many larger particles embedded in this 3000 grit for it to really be a 3000 grit. And honestly, the 6000 grit stone is more like other more expensive stones, 3000 grit. So you can actually see the large particles on the surface here of this 3000 grit stone. And looking at the scratch pattern of the 3000 grit Resin Pro, especially right along the apex, you can see the coarseness of the apex. And in contrast with a 1200 grit sharp ball plated diamond stone, you can see that there's really not a ton of difference here. And you can really sort of see the same cutting characteristics in both of these edges due to the contamination of the 3000 grit. Now the problem here is that you can actually jump directly from a 1000 grit plated stone or 1200 grit plated stone all the way up to an actual 3000 grit resin bonded stone, which is the 6000 grit due to the grit contamination. So basically what that means is that, in my opinion, I think you're actually better off not buying these cheaper resin bonded stones if you already have a coarse and a fine plated diamond stone. And you're better off spending that $60 or $70 on a higher quality resin bonded stone with basically no grit contamination. This is the Gen D 6 micron or around 3000 grit resin bonded stone. And in my opinion, this is a much better buy at $60 to $70 than this whole set here if you already have plated stones. So in looking at the Gen D 6 micron scratch pattern, you can actually really see a difference, especially along the apex. And then here we'll switch back over to the Resin 3000, and again, you can see where all of those large particles are really causing a problem along the apex, which is actually really where it matters. This is actually the same knife, same steel, same everything, just for reference. And to tell you the truth, I would actually recommend plated stones over resin bonded stones for the first 4 grits anyway, because you don't have any of that dishing problem. You have a longer lasting abrasive than these, and they stay flat. So basically these cheaper options are going to do a better job. Now that's not to say that these resin bonded stones don't work, because they absolutely do. There's just little tiny issues I think that makes another setup a little bit better of a value. The coarse stones, they wear out relatively quickly. There's just not a whole lot of abrasive here. The 200 and the 400 already are showing noticeable dishing on the stone. And you also don't even need a lot of these in-between grits. You can skip a lot of these in-between grits. You don't need to progress 800, 1200, 3000, 6000. You just don't need all of those in-between grits. All you're doing is basically wasting time. You can skip directly from the 200 up to the 1200. So if I was going to fix this system here, I would actually make this probably a 2-stone system or a 2-stone set. I think that a better value would be the 1200 grit and the 6000 grit sold for like 24, 25 bucks. Because you could pair these stones with a cheaper coarse grit plated diamond stone in the 220 grit range, and you would have basically everything that you needed for around 40, 50 bucks. So that, in my opinion, would be a much better value, and you can get rid of all of these stones that you don't need and all of that wasted time skipping between grits. Anyway, I hope this video helps make a decision on whether or not you want to purchase these. By all means, if you want to try these, go right ahead. Just know that I think that there are better options out there. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.